Hello and welcome to another video exploration of the story. My name is Scott Dalen, an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos every week as a companion going along with a Bible study going on in my congregation based on something called The Story. It kind of looks like that, written by or put together by a guy named Randy Frazee a few years back. The Story is a condensed Bible narrative that takes the overarching story and narrative from the scriptures and kind of brings it down into a more approachable uh, aspect, I guess is maybe a way to look at it, that just more approachable, kind of takes out some of the non-narrative portions of the scriptures and really gives us an overarching look of what God's up to within our reality. So that's kind of what the story is. We're going through it chapter by chapter here in my congregation, and this particular week we looked at chapter 25, which is entitled Jesus, the Son of God. Now, this particular chapter really kind of takes a look at the closing portion of Jesus' ministry. This chapter, as well as the two previous ones, kind of gave us the overarching look at that. The first portion of it really aimed at the notion of invitation, as Jesus would encounter people and invite them into relationship, invite them to share time and experience with one another, and then calling us to then go forward and do the same. So that's kind of the first aspect, which was 2 chapters ago. Then last time, in the previous chapter, we looked at the notion of Jesus' teaching styles, of which he had a few different ones, parables being a big one and a very prominent part of that particular chapter, which also really dominated a lot of our discussion as we talked about some of the different parables. But then also looking at some of his more large-scale teaching moments, more sermon-style teaching perhaps, the Sermon on the Mount being the big one that was featured in that. Now in this portion, as I mentioned, this is kind of the tail end, and we see that Jesus turns his face towards Jerusalem. He knows where this is going, he knows where it's heading, he knows that's where it's going to culminate. And so now this closing portion is as he and the disciples are moving that direction. Now in this time, Jesus is making no secret of what's going to happen. They're called passion predictions, and I think they happen 3 times, if memory serves me correctly. And we have at least a couple of them here in this chapter. As Jesus shares with his disciples, this is where this is going. And there's conversation of who do the people say that I am. That portion is in here, and some say that you're John the Baptist, some Elijah, some the prophet. And Jesus says, but who do you say that I am? And Peter says, we know that you are the Messiah, the one of God. And so then Jesus says, you're right. And now this is what that means. So we start to see some of that, and we continue to see the tension ramping up between Jesus and kind of the powers that be that oppose him throughout this portion as they're moving towards Jerusalem. Now we actually do hear that he arrives in Jerusalem as well. So we have the triumphal entry is a part of this chapter, as well as just a little bit of that final week that Jesus spends in Jerusalem prior to his arrest. Now that will kind of pick up with in the next chapter. But so some of the major things that were going on within this chapter, some of the major aspects besides the who do people say that I am thing that I referenced a moment ago, we have the transfiguration that is featured, and kind of a mixture of the different gospel accounts of that. The raising of Lazarus that comes out of John's gospel, that's a pretty big portion, a pretty big story that's featured as well. Then the triumphal entry, as I mentioned, as well as just some of his final teaching moments are kind of the major highlights of the arc of this particular chapter. And within our discussion, we talked quite a bit about the general locations where things happened. Now, this particular chapter is a mix of all 4 Gospels, though Mark and John have the largest portions. We do see a little bit that comes out of Matthew, a little bit that comes out of Luke, but the other 2 are definitely the stronger of the prominently featured moments or passages. And as I mentioned, there's several miraculous things and this tension that's building. Now, some of the things that we talked about last night, again, we as we've gotten into the New Testament, if you've been tracking these videos or if you've been in the discussions, we've seen a little bit of a shift away from some of the more academic structured questions into really a lot more discussion type things with people bringing up questions or thoughts or comments, which has been really very exciting as we've we've gone through those discussions. This time around was more of the same. Uh, and some of the things that we focused on really had to do with um, some of the statements that Jesus had, some of the statements that he made, and some of the um, reaction to him. That was actually a very large portion of our conversation, really before we even dove into the chapter, was focusing around the general reaction of the people to Jesus, and why it's we hear about the tension that we hear, and on the flip side, why we hear about the moments of belief and acceptance. A lot of what we talked about really focused on John's gospel because of that, and that just was kind of the direction that we went. And we discussed some of the history behind John's gospel, when it was written, what was going on culturally by the time it was written. All four of the gospels were written quite a while after Jesus, after his life and death and resurrection. Late first century is when scholars think that they were written. And so quite a bit's already happened. And we talked some about the importance of community within John's gospel, that so much of it seems to be aimed at community. And what does that mean? Community or relationship. And the notion that Jesus is God, because the Word became flesh, the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelled among us. And that's Jesus. We hear that in the opening portion of John's gospel. But why is that? Why did the Word become flesh and dwell among us? Well, it's to overcome the power of sin and darkness. And sin in John's gospel is not believing that Jesus is God, not believing that Jesus is who he says he is, not believing what Jesus has to say, what God has to say. That's sin, singular, not plural, singular within John's gospel. And sin, not believing the promises of God, that's what breaks that relationship. That's what forces the division between humanity and God, also between humanity and humanity, with those broken relationships. And so God, through Jesus, or Jesus as God, however you want to look at it, came to repair that relationship. That was the work. And again, kind of coming back to what's going on around the time that this was written, well, the community that John was writing to were formerly Jewish people that had, because of their faith in Christ, they've been kicked out of the synagogue. They've been denied access to the cultural community that they have always known. Now, if you're familiar with the history of Christianity, or the Way, as it was called initially, it was not intended to be a separate religion from Judaism, but it was an offshoot of that. It was very similar in notion to how Martin Luther was not trying to start a new denomination. He was trying to reform the Catholic Church. Jesus was trying to, quote unquote, reform the church into what God intended it to be. But gradually there became this division, and the synagogues would kick you out. And that's what has happened to this small community of believers that's focused around John. And it's also after the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the Romans. So there's been a great upheaval in terms of the culture and the life that these people have always known. The center of their culture, which was the temple, has been destroyed, so they no longer have that. They've been denied access to the synagogue, which is their community center, so that's all changed. So these notions of broken relationship would have been very, very familiar to John's audience. And so as Jesus speaks about the notion of healing this breach, healing this broken relationship, and making that possible again, that would have been very, very familiar to them. So that was a really large discussion that we had kind of at the beginning, focusing around kind of some of the cultural differences, and as well as discussing a little bit about what is the reaction of people of the Jewish faith to Christ now, and has that changed? And so we talked a little bit about that. Now, I'm not an expert by any means, but But I have known individuals that have talked about uh, conversion, that they were formerly Jewish and they have become Christian. So that does happen. But again, I'm not an expert, so I'm not going to try and reveal anything there. That was part of our discussion too. And then also, once we got to within the chapter, we talked about the Transfiguration some, but since we had just discussed that in and around the gospel lesson a few weeks ago, that was pretty fresh. So we didn't do a lot with that, but we did talk quite a bit about the raising of Lazarus and the kind of focusing around death. And so much of this portion of this chapter really takes a hard look at that. We have Jesus' views on death because he's encountering it in Lazarus, who has died. We have his teachings on that and on the resurrection, and that raised some interesting discussion as well when he says, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, though they die, will live, and those who believe in me will have life and will not die. And it's kind of like, what? Almost seems like a little bit of a contradiction there, but we discussed some of that, and I've focused on that for a while as well. But then we kind of turned our attention over to the notion of death and the hope of what lies beyond for us as believers. We talked also about the last days and what they will be like, and will there be some who will not experience death because they will be living when the second coming of Christ occurs, and so what will that look like for them? And we discussed some of that, and we don't have really clear notions of what exactly is going to happen and what will occur and what will the resurrection be like, and will those who have not died when Jesus come back, will they experience the resurrection, or will they just experience eternal life and they will not die? And the scriptures give us little glimmers of that, little hints, but we don't know. And yet, throughout all of this, we cling to the hope and the promises that Christ has made, that our faith in him means that there is more beyond death. And that was kind of how our discussion came to a close last night as we talked over this. And as Jesus encounters death and overcomes it, that's some definite foreshadowing to what he will achieve, or what God will achieve in the death and resurrection of Christ, and that the knowledge that God promises that we will share in that. So that's kind of what went on in our discussion last night. Again, it kind of went off topic in terms of the different highlighted stories within this particular chapter, and that's okay. But our discussion does that from time to time as it raises questions and things that we ponder on. So if you have thoughts or questions or comments based on either this video or your reading of this chapter, please share those down in the comment section, and we'll continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, I hope you have a blessed week, and we'll catch you next time.